Hi, welcome to the Libertarian Alternative. My name is Mark Selzer, and the Libertarian Alternative is an educational television show brought to your community by the Libertarian Party. Thanks for watching. Today's guest is
Michael D'Alessi.
And you're from the Reason Foundation.
That's right. I'm the Director of Natural Resource Policy.
And so what does that mean, and what does the Reason Foundation do? What is the Reason Foundation?
What is the Reason Foundation? Well, it's a basically a think tank, and I look at environmental issues. Reason looks at all sorts of issues, from transportation to sprawl to privatization around the world, outsourcing, all sorts of economic policy issues.
In regards to the environment. So are you a pro-environment? Would you consider the Reason Foundation to be pro-environment?
Well, definitely, in that I am an environmentalist in the sense that I care about the environment, but I also care deeply about people and how they fit into the environment, which differentiates me from not all, but some of these sort of more traditional environmentalists.
So where are you from? You live in the Bay Area?
I live in San Francisco. I grew up in Miami.
Okay. So living in San Francisco is a good place to talk about the environment, and
it is.
There's a lot of environmental activism, I guess, in that area, or at least it would have the reputation for it. What kind of things you issue policy papers here at the Reason Foundation, and this is to try to influence legislation regarding the environment?
It's policy oriented. Yeah. There's a difference between a lobbying group, which is out there trying to influence, spending all of its efforts trying to influence policy, and we're more generally trying to make people think more about the underlying institutions, incentives, property rights, why people behave the way that they do, how we can get better governance, better institutions. So a lot of times doing that involves policy change. So we are very aware of politics and what's happening in Sacramento and DC and all sorts of other state capitals, but we're focused on the ideas ahead of and then hoping the politics will follow.
One of the main clashes in environment is usually with property rights. Environmental activists are usually in some way clashing with the property rights of other people. But actually, in your research that you've done, or the research the Reason Foundation has done, we found that it's really not as much at odds as a lot of people perceive it to be, that if someone owns property, they will take better care of it and want to make sure that it's not polluted, that it's actually the land that's owned by the government that ends up being polluted.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly true. That's another case of the underlying institutions and how they affect behavior. The classic environmental sort of catchphrase in a lot of places is the tragedy of the commons, which was phrased by Garrett Hardin in his famous essay in the late 1960s. And he was talking about population. He did some kind of loopy stuff about population. And his terminology, if you're an academic, wasn't very good, because a commons is often not just a free-for-all.
That sounds like something you'd say in the 1700s, it sounds like.
Well, yeah, it's throughout history we've had a tragedy of the commons, but it basically describes an example where valuable resources are essentially free for the taking. Not surprisingly, they're depleted. The classic example, and I've done a lot of work on fisheries, I won't bore you too much with fish, but fisheries are kind of the classic example where if you and I are fishermen, and we look at a case, and I'm looking at a case, well, if I don't catch that fish,
Someone else will,
then I catch it. Even if it means we're both basically destroying our own source of livelihood, because we're catching more than replacement, we're catching juveniles. The history of fisheries is replete with examples where people have gone out and destroyed their own source of livelihood. So a lot of people say, oh, well, they're just greedy, rapacious, cretins, or we didn't regulate them well enough, or heavily enough, or strongly enough. And that's not the case. It's not that people are cretins, it's that people are smart and ingenious, and they respond to the rules of the game that they live under. And if the rules of that game is get while the getting's good, or get while you can, people do.
And as an example, though, the people that do commercial fishing have learned over the years to start self-regulating, haven't they? So they don't put themselves
Well,
out of business?
in cases where they can, where they have, say, a legal right to access a fishery, and there's a small enough community where they can start talking to each other. But you know, if in that example where you and if I don't catch the fish, you do, you and I can say, okay, hey, wait a second, this is crazy. Why don't we leave some fish in there, and there'll be more next year?
Right.
And that works great if it's just you and I, and we're the only ones who can fish there.
But
if you and I agree not to catch it, and someone else comes in and takes it, then that, you know, it falls apart. So you need some kind of legal or at least informal territory or access, some kind of right. There's lots of great examples where people have done it extra legally. There's a lobster fishery in Maine where there's no legal territory, but if I put my traps in the wrong place, they're not going to be there when I get back. And if I do it a second time, then maybe my engine doesn't work when I try to go out and get there. And if I keep doing it enough, you know, then it's sort of, I get the message, you know.
Some stronger way.
And it's effective because then once outsiders are excluded, then you and I can say, hey, this is crazy. We should make this resource. We'll be a lot better off if this lasts into the future.
Right.
So we don't overharvest it and then the lobsters are there.
Because if you're a fisherman, there's no fish, you're kind of out of business and you have to go and...
Not always, because, you know, oftentimes the government will come in and just send you suitcases full of cash to help you through your hardship.
Really? So there's a lot of corporate welfare in the fishing industry as well?
Corporate might be not quite the right word, but just like ag subsidies cause a lot of problems, fishing subsidies and bailouts, and you know, there's this sort of, well, okay, you and I are having trouble reaching an agreement, and maybe if we catch them all, we won't be too bad off because we can go to our local representative and say, look at this hardship we're facing. And so
like the airline
again, incentives make a difference, and if you think there's a good chance you can
you can profit
qualify
from
for a hardship
if you get yourself into one, kind of like the airlines are a good example of that. So what about other issues with property rights? I mean, that's one example of the tragedy of the commons. The other is that often when you have a national park, other places like that, whoever gives the most money to the politicians seems to be able to come in and get a special variance always to pollute or clear cut or strip mine or do something that's harmful to that land. But then land that is privately owned is usually guarded much better against pollution.
Well, in general.
In general?
Well, it's how the property rights are structured, you know, and a river is a commons also. So pollution is again a commons problem. I get all the benefits I have this gunk, you know, and I want to get rid of it because it's not very nice. And if I throw it in the river, I get all the benefits of getting rid of that gunk. And the costs are shared by everyone, and that's another sort of classic tragedy of the commons kind of thing. And the same thing with, the great thing about well-defined property rights is the sort of two things. There's the kind of good fences make good neighbors. So property rights give someone a sound footing with which to start sort of making deals, bargaining. If I know where I stand and you know where you stand, then you and I can talk. If we don't know where we stand and we each go talk to our local representative, it's kind of a zero-sum back and forth, I gain at your expense kind of thing. Whereas if it's you've got this and I've got this, then if I want some of that, I got to talk to you, we can work out a deal, we can start building up.
And no one owns the river. If it's owned by the people or the government, then no one really owns it, and there's really no one to sue you if you're dumping.
Well, and then we wind up with a regulatory solution that is a big, giant, you know, hammer. And it sort of crushes things, and it misses some things and crushes other things. That's why a lot of times